Welcome to Civil War Digital Digest. I'm Will. We're back on a remote recording with Matt Borders. We've talked with him recently about Henry Baxter from the 7th Michigan, and we alluded that Matt has a new book out with his writing partner, Joe Stahl. Matt, introduce the book to us.
I'd like to introduce The Faces of Union Soldiers at Fredericksburg. This is the third book in the Faces of series for Joe and my collaboration. And it has 30 images of men who fought at the Battle of Fredericksburg from all sections of the battlefield.
All right, well, Fredericksburg, most of us think about Marye's Heights. We think sometimes about the river crossing. Give me a little bigger context. Why Fredericksburg and why the choice of these men at Fredericksburg, and how do you organize the book?
As you know, Will, our first two books were looking exclusively at the Maryland campaign. First, we did Antietam, the big show, and then we had the follow-up work looking at South Mountain and Harper's Ferry, even though they come, obviously, before Antietam. The natural progression of that was to move into the Fredericksburg campaign. Now, my co-author, Joe Stahl, he has a vast collection of CDVs, or carte de vis. These images are the paper images that were mass-produced during the American Civil War. They were cheap enough that even the soldiers themselves, with their $13 or $15 a month, could afford them. But Joe's been collecting these for decades. I've begun collecting myself as well. And so we really dug into his collection, much like we did with the first two books, to build this one.
Well, talk to me a little bit. That's where we get the images from. Talk to me about how you organize the book. And are we going to just read a face, or is there a method to your madness when we start the book?
Right. There is a method, much like we did with the earlier works. We've broken the various portions of the Army of the Potomac down into certain chapters. Our first chapter is actually looking at George Meade's division and the attack of the Pennsylvania reserves across what becomes known as Slaughter Pen Farm. The brief breaching, but a breaching nonetheless, of Confederate lines there around Prospect Hill, the repulse of Meade's men, and then the second chapter actually deals with the attempts to pull his guys out of there.
All right, great. So we've been to Slaughter Pen. After that, where do we go in the book?
We are going to shift north, and we do discuss a little bit through our introduction of the book the fact that we really have almost two battle plans moving forward at Fredericksburg. Both the attacking at Marye's Heights and the attacking at Slaughter Pen Farm were both described as a diversion for the other.
Well, I must say, one of the things I really like when you talk about that is as the chapters go later, you put a map with each of the chapters so you can sort of see, okay, as you go to the regiments, you don't have to flip all the way back to a master map. You can flip to the head of the chapter and find the regiment you're reading about. But as you get later in, one of the things that really spoke to me is some of those later maps are littered with not long rectangles, but little squares as regiments break up from their charge up Marye's Heights, and you're seeing new regiments being fed in, meat being fed to the grinder, and you can see the scraps laying around, and that really brought something to me as I was reading it.
Absolutely, and if we can give our own little shout out, that would be the great map work that Brad Godfrey does. Brad is a colleague in the Antietam Battlefield Guide, so Joe and I know him very well. That's how we developed the relationship for getting the maps for our books. He was extremely helpful with the Maryland campaign, and by the time we had done our second book, he had already produced his Maps of Fredericksburg book, and so we spoke with Brad and were able to get some of his maps for use in our Faces of Union Soldiers at Fredericksburg.
Fantastic. Well, before we move on too far, we have to talk about how the Union Army gets to Fredericksburg. Can you talk about the river a little bit?
Absolutely. Before we even get to the Rappahannock, we've had some major upheaval in the Army of the Potomac. George McClellan is removed from command of the Army of the Potomac in early November of '62, and Ambrose Burnside, one of his best friends, is placed in charge of the Army. Initially, Burnside is basically going to keep on keeping on with with the advance of the army that McClellan had laid out, but he would become, or he, I should say, comes under significant pressure by Washington to develop his own plan to move on Confederate forces, specifically move on Richmond as quickly as possible. And to his credit, Burnside does. He is going to steal a march on Robert E. Lee. I know we don't often think about such things happening, but he absolutely does. He is going to beat Lee to the Rappahannock River. Fredericksburg's on the opposite side. He's at Falmouth. He's ready to cross, and then he doesn't have any boats. He has to wait. And over a 10-day period, the Army of Northern Virginia is going to be filtering into Fredericksburg, and they start to dig in. And so by the time the pontoons finally do arrive, the Confederates are in a very, very strong defensive position. Robert E. Lee wants to try to slow the Union advance as much as possible. He would unleash Barksdale's Mississippians, and they will play havoc with the pontooners or the engineers that are trying to lay the bridges, actually lay the pontoon bridges across the Rappahannock on December 11th.
Well, talk with me a little bit about the methodology, because I know you have a regiment and a man. Talk to me, for somebody who hasn't seen any of your three books, the methodology really hasn't changed. When you introduce a regiment and a man, talk about what that capsule looks like and what a person can find in there.
We lay out a regiment, how that regiment was raised, where they were raised, where they're from, a little bit on their previous service before the Fredericksburg campaign. We just briefly touch on Fredericksburg and then lay out the rest of that regiment's career as well. And the reason we only briefly touch on Fredericksburg is because we've also included the after-action report, or at least portions of the after-action report, talking about what specifically that regiment did at Fredericksburg. And then, of course, we try to develop that more when talking about an individual from that regiment. What Joe really prides himself on, and understandably so, is trying to get the men who were in the ranks, who were in the mud, who were fighting on the front lines. The collection is not all colonels and above. It is mostly guys who are leading troops, a lot of lieutenants. A lot of lieutenants got their picture taken when they made officer. So there's a lot of those images in there. We also have a number of privates and a whole bunch of NCOs as well, both sergeants and corporals of various stripe, if you'll excuse the pun.
Well, great. Well, there's a lot to see in the book. I've read it several times. Gang, it's worth an investment, both of your money and your time. There's information below how you can get your copy. Okay, Matt, I asked you this last year when Fredericksburg was about to come out. I'm going to ask it again. What's next?
That's a good question. We actually do have a fourth book. I'm just about ready to turn the manuscript in, and it is going to be looking at the Gettysburg campaign. Figure number 4, it's about time we got to Pennsylvania. But we're specifically going to be looking at the fighting around Culp's Hill and the Union 12th Corps. So it's Faces of Union Soldiers at Culp's Hill, action on the decisive federal right.
Fantastic. When do we think we'll see it?
Hopefully by battle anniversary.
Okay, fantastic. Well, best of luck to it. Thank you very much for coming back, and thank you for spending your time with Civil War Digital Digest. We hope that you found another small connection. For that, it's sometimes a little weird that we have to do episodes like doing things remotely this way. This software is paid for by money provided to us from the CWDD coffee grinders, and we say thank you to them. There are patrons on Patreon. Everybody there gives a little bit, and that adds up to quite a bit and allows us to keep doing what we're doing. Love to have you take a look at it. Also, we want to make sure you keep finding a good connection to history. We'll see you down the road.